It started with a blood-curdling scream so loud it made me drop the moving box right onto my foot. I limped around the corner of our new home to find my wife Ellie, still in her Marine Corps hoodie and carrying a duffel bag, being berated by a woman wielding a clipboard like it was a loaded weapon. "You can't just park wherever you want," the woman shrieked, arms flailing as if the fate of the world depended on our driveway staying empty. Ellie looked confused, calm, and, if you knew her well, mildly entertained. I knew the look. It was the same look she gave a warlord who once tried to bluff his way past a checkpoint in Kandahar. The only difference was that this warlord wasn't wearing oversized sunglasses and a leopard print blouse. Welcome to the neighborhood. 2 days earlier, Ellie and I had arrived at our new home in Willow Heights, a pristine suburban slice of paradise with trimmed hedges, perfectly symmetrical mailboxes, and a glaring lack of personality. We'd bought the place after Ellie's retirement from active duty. 20 years in the Marines, countless tours, commendations, a Bronze Star, and now a peace. Or so we thought. The plan was simple. Get a quiet house in a peaceful neighborhood where we could decompress, plant a vegetable garden, and maybe finally finish our joint goal of learning to make decent sushi at home. It wasn't even noon on move-in day before we heard whispers about the local HOA president. "She's active," our next-door neighbor muttered, eyes darting toward the street. "Karen runs everything. And everyone." We thought he was exaggerating. Our driveway was wide, clean, and, for all legal intents and purposes, ours. Ellie had parked there to unload the last few boxes. I had gone inside to set up the router when I heard the scream. That's when I met Karen Aldridge. Karen had the uncanny ability to make everything sound like an emergency, even if it was just someone parking on their own property. She stomped down the sidewalk like a marching band gone rogue, pointing at Ellie's truck like it had personally insulted her ancestors. "This isn't a parking lot," she snapped. "There are rules." Ellie, ever the professional, calmly asked, "I'm just unloading boxes. Is there a problem?" That question only fueled the fire. Karen squinted at Ellie, completely ignoring the military duffel, the name tape on her hoodie, or the slight bulge of a service tag dangling from her key ring. She launched into a speech about standards and setting precedents and the neighborhood image. I watched, frozen mid-step, half expecting Karen to whip out a ruler and measure the distance from the curb. Then she said it. The line that would come to define this entire mess. "Just because you're new here doesn't mean you get special privileges." Ellie tilted her head. Not the irritated kind of tilt. The one that said she'd just mentally filed this woman under threat level, minimal but annoying. Ellie didn't argue. She simply said, "I understand," and continued unloading. Karen stood there, waiting for a fight that never came, until the silence made her uncomfortable enough to flounce off. I waited until Karen had disappeared behind her fence of rose bushes and judgment before walking over. "So, what just happened?" I asked. Ellie smirked. "First territorial challenge. Probably thinks she won. Let's finish unpacking." But I could tell she was annoyed. Not because Karen yelled. She'd been yelled at by people who outranked entire countries. It was the entitlement. The fact that Karen didn't even pause to ask or show any decency. Ellie took a deep breath and pushed a box through the front door, but not before muttering under her breath, "This lady really just tried to out-discipline a Marine." That night, over pizza boxes and unopened suitcases, we sat on the back porch trying to laugh it off. "Maybe she's just overzealous," I offered. "Maybe she's a tyrant in capri pants," Ellie shot back. The next morning, Ellie parked in the driveway again. No moving boxes. No excuse. Just because it was our home, and we didn't need one. Karen didn't show up immediately. But at 9:06 a.m., her garage door opened like a villain reveal in a spy movie. Out she came, dressed like suburban royalty with a visor, gloves, and the infamous clipboard. She walked past Ellie's truck, paused, glanced at the license plate, then wrote something on her notepad. Ellie stood on the porch sipping coffee in silence. Later that day, we received a friendly notice, taped to our mailbox. It was a formal HOA complaint citing non-compliant driveway usage, a made-up code I recognized as pure Karen fiction. I read it aloud, then handed it to Ellie. She read it once and smiled. She doesn't know what she just started. 2 days passed. We kept unpacking. Karen kept circling. Every morning, she'd walk her Pomeranian around the block, slowing near our house like a hawk watching prey she was too lazy to catch. Ellie began tracking her routine with more precision than she'd once used for air assault schedules. On the 5th day, Ellie decided to make a statement. She waited until Karen's usual loop, then parked her truck exactly halfway in the driveway, just enough to make it visible. And then she stood next to it in her full marine dress blues. It wasn't Veterans Day. It wasn't for show. It was Ellie's way of reminding herself who she was, especially when others forgot. I watched from the porch as Karen appeared around the corner. The second her eyes locked on Ellie, she froze. Her dog yelped as she tightened the leash too suddenly. Her jaw dropped slightly, and she actually stumbled over a rock on the sidewalk. Ellie didn't move. She simply stood tall, shoulders back, ribbons gleaming in the sunlight. Karen hesitated, then kept walking, but faster now, as if the metals were chasing her. We thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of it. But if Karen had anything, it was persistence and a complete lack of shame. The very next morning, she returned, not with words but with action. She snapped a photo of Ellie's parked truck and began typing furiously into her phone. Then, in the afternoon, another notice arrived. Second warning for repeated violation. Driveway blockage. Ellie didn't even read the whole thing. She just folded it once and dropped it into the recycling bin. Time to play chess, she said. What Karen didn't know was that Ellie wasn't just retired. She was strategic. Trained in logistics, surveillance, and psychological operations. She once diffused a tribal dispute in Afghanistan using only a translator, a soccer ball, and 2 goat. Karen thought intimidation was a letter and a frown. It was becoming very clear to both of us. We were not dealing with a community leader. We were dealing with a suburban dictator with too much time and too little perspective. I didn't say anything, but I was already planning our next move. Ellie had fought for the right to live in peace, and I would be damned if someone with a paper badge and a vendetta tried to take that from her. And so, as the sun set over Willow Heights and the sprinkler systems hummed like a false sense of peace, we sat on our porch again, this time not laughing, just planning. Because what Karen had mistaken for a silent housewife in boots was about to teach her a lesson in respect, discipline, and why you never, ever poke a sleeping Marine. The next morning arrived with the kind of calm that made you suspicious. Birds chirped, the sun rose lazily over the rooftops, and for a brief moment, it felt like the neighborhood had hit the reset button. But Ellie and I both knew better. Karen wasn't the kind of person to surrender quietly. She was the type to retreat and reload. And sure enough, by the time Ellie came back from her morning jog, there was a new surprise waiting. Another HOA notice, this time stapled to our front door like it was a medieval decree. Final warning. Continued violation of HOA driveway guidelines. Next infraction will result in formal citation and fines. Ellie read it, blinked once, then looked at me with a deadpan stare. What do you think the punishment is for parking in your own driveway? Community exile. I couldn't help but laugh, but Ellie wasn't smiling. She was tired. Not from the run, but from having to justify her right to exist peacefully in her own home. Her entire life had been about service and structure, yet here she was being penalized by someone who treated a parking spot like a war zone. That afternoon, she changed into jeans and a flannel shirt, pulled her hair back, and told me she was going out for a walk. Not a casual one, but the kind where she wore her marine boot. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded. She returned 30 minutes later with a stack of papers she'd collected from the HOA website and County Housing Board. She sat at the kitchen table and began reading every page like she was back in the field reviewing tactical briefings. I brought her coffee, and we quietly sifted through policy documents, community maps, and the HOA charter, buried in which were some interesting contradictions. The driveway rule Karen cited? It didn't exist. Not only that, but Karen had been issuing citations based on policies that had never been formally approved by the HOA board. Ellie flipped through a folder, tapped the page, and said, "This is her playbook. She's banking on no one checking." That night we shared dinner with our neighbor, Mike, the same one who'd warned us about Karen on our first day. Mike was a soft-spoken guy in his 40s, kept to himself mostly, and worked in cybersecurity. Over grilled chicken and corn, he confirmed what we suspected. Karen reinterprets rules. She'll say something like, "It's a guideline," and then enforce it like law. She's been president for 6 years because no one else wants the job, and she uses that to do whatever she wants. Ellie leaned forward. "Has she ever been formally audited?" Mike shook his head. "Not even once. And last year she got a new patio cover approved under community maintenance funds." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "So we're dealing with an unchecked system and a tyrant who thinks she's Caesar." Mike nodded slowly. "That's about right." After dinner, we returned home and began the real planning. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. It was about stopping someone who had abused her authority long enough and was now targeting a veteran in her own home like it was a personal playground. Ellie pulled out a folder and labeled it K-Files. It was equal parts clever and ominous. We started logging everything: dates, times, photos of notices, recordings from our doorbell camera. Ellie had spent decades collecting intelligence on foreign soil. Now she was turning that skill inward, on one woman with too much power and no accountability. 2 days later, Ellie parked her truck proudly in the driveway again. This time, there were no boxes, no distractions, just her, standing beside the vehicle with her arms folded, waiting. And right on cue, Karen came marching down the sidewalk, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't yell this time. Instead, she took a photo and said, "I've already warned you. This will be sent to the board." Ellie gave her a soft smile. "I've read the entire HOA charter. There's no rule that prohibits driveway parking on personal property." Karen froze. "That's not how we interpret it," she replied. Ellie didn't flinch. She asked. Karen stuttered, then turned around and stormed off, visibly rattled. That evening, Ellie filed a formal rebuttal with the county's HOA regulation office and submitted a complaint about Karen's harassment. She attached screenshots, recordings, copies of notices, and side-by-side comparisons of the actual HOA charter. She copied me and Mike on the email. Mike sent back a simple reply. "That's the most thorough takedown I've ever seen outside of a courtroom." But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, we woke up to a spray of small citations placed in our mailbox. One said we had an unauthorized flagpole because we had mounted the American flag on our porch. Another cited non-compliant mailbox paint, even though it was beige, the exact color listed in the neighborhood guidelines. Karen was escalating. Ellie chuckled and said, "This is her panic mode." She wasn't angry. She was focused. That afternoon, we attended the monthly HOA meeting, which was held in the local clubhouse. We sat in the back, quiet observers at first. Karen stood at the front like she was hosting a game show, rattling off neighborhood complaints, from lawn lengths to curtain patterns. When she finally got to the parking issue, she declared, "Some residents are choosing to ignore our long-standing practices, and that compromises the look and harmony of our community." Ellie stood. Everyone turned. Calmly, firmly, and with her voice steady as steel, she said, "I have a copy of the HOA charter here, and there is no such clause that prohibits driveway parking on private property. Furthermore, your citations reference codes that don't exist." Karen's face went white. The room fell silent. One older man in the front muttered, "She's right." Karen tried to pivot, claiming the board had voted on interpretations, but when Ellie asked to see the vote records and board meeting notes, Karen hesitated. Ellie pressed, If you're enforcing penalties on residents, those rules must be publicly documented and approved. Do you have those records? Karen stammered. They were discussed. There was consensus. Ellie didn't blink. Consensus isn't law. Karen abruptly moved to adjourn the meeting, but not before we'd handed out a copy of our formal complaint to several residents. The seeds were planted, and over the next week, whispers began to spread. People started checking their own record. Others dug into Karen's spending. Mike helped us build a secure online folder where residents could anonymously upload photos, receipts, and inconsistencies. Someone found evidence that Karen used HOA funds to host a planning retreat in Palm Springs, by herself. Someone else uncovered that she'd passed fines against renters who weren't even under HOA jurisdiction. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. But Ellie was calm through it all. She had no interest in revenge, just restoration. I didn't serve my country just to be bullied on my own land, she said. This isn't just about me. It's about what she's done to everyone here. As the sun set that night, she sat on our porch with a notepad, drawing lines between names, dates, and policy violations. I watched her in awe. Calm, methodical, and unshaken. The neighborhood began to hum with quiet tension, like the heavy stillness before a summer storm. Karen's reign had long gone unchallenged, and now that Ellie had exposed her tactics for what they were, people didn't know whether to cheer or hide behind their shutters. Some residents stopped to whisper words of support when they passed us on the street. Others nervously avoided eye contact, afraid of getting caught in the fallout. But Ellie wasn't stopping. She wasn't on a mission for applause. She was after accountability. The citations had stopped showing up in our mailbox, but the silence from Karen wasn't a white flag. It was the hush of regrouping. Ellie knew that kind of silence too well. She had seen it before in far more dangerous places. It was the same kind of stillness before an ambush. One afternoon, we received a letter postmarked from the HOA board but signed only by the committee. It was full of vague language about harmonious compliance, cohesive aesthetics, and neighborly cooperation. It didn't mention Ellie by name, but the insinuation was clear. We were being accused of disrupting the unity of the community. Ellie read it and shook her head slowly. "This is psychological warfare, suburb edition," she muttered. But she wasn't rattled. If anything, it made her more focused. She reached out to a few residents we'd met at the HOA meeting and invited them over for coffee and conversation. Mike came too, bringing along a laptop and a folder labeled Surveillance Logs. That alone told me things were about to escalate. We gathered around the kitchen island, the group small but determined. A retired schoolteacher who'd once been fined for having non-regulation wind chimes. A young couple penalized for hanging a pride flag. An older gentleman who had paid almost $500 in mystery fines over 3 years with no explanation. Everyone had a story. Everyone had documentation. And each piece fit into a bigger puzzle that Ellie was rapidly putting together. Mike had already created a secure, encrypted online archive. Ellie uploaded every document, every photo, every letter. What started as a folder had grown into a digital case file Karen couldn't erase. We were calling it Operation Respect. That same week, Ellie hosted a small cookout in our driveway. She called it a community meet and greet, complete with hot dogs, lemonade, and lawn chairs. It wasn't political. It wasn't confrontational. It was simply neighborly. Veterans from her old unit came too, off-duty, casual, laughing and shaking hands. Karen showed up 10 minutes into the event, wearing a sun hat and tight smile. She didn't say a word at first. She just walked around, arms folded, taking mental notes like a hall monitor at recess. Then she cleared her throat and said, "This gathering does not appear on the HOA calendar." Was this event formally approved? Ellie didn't miss a beat. It's a private social gathering on private property. No formal approval needed. Karen scowled. But you're using public sidewalks and HOA maintains space for overflow. Ellie stepped forward. Actually, I checked. That sidewalk section falls under county maintenance, and I confirmed it with public records. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the small group of veterans standing beside Ellie, their faces curious and amused. One of them, a towering man named Duke, smiled at Karen and said, "You want to find me too?" Karen stammered, shook her head, and stormed away, her heels clicking so loudly they echoed down the driveway. The cookout resumed, laughter rising louder as if the tension had been grilled away with the burgers. That night, Ellie reviewed the footage from our doorbell camera and noted something odd. Karen had come by again, this time after dark. She lingered at the edge of our lawn, flashlight in hand, peering into the driveway. It was subtle, but suspicious. Ellie saved the clip and sent it to Mike, who enhanced the footage and confirmed it. Karen had taken pictures of our house. Multiple angles. She was building something. Possibly retaliation. The next morning, we found 3 more HOA notices. One accused us of unauthorized lighting on our porch, another cited non-conforming lawn edge curvature, and the last one claimed our trash cans had been visible from the road for longer than regulation allowed. Ellie looked at the stack and sighed. She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But Ellie had grown up in a world where tactics like this were called flares. Desperate moves to signal trouble or distraction. It only confirmed one thing: Karen was flailing. Ellie decided it was time to go on offense. We gathered every signed document, every receipt, every policy violation Karen had enforced without board approval. Mike had even traced some of the fines to a separate HOA account Karen had opened under her maiden name. That account showed expenses unrelated to the community. Spa visits, luxury candles, personal deliveries, and even a hotel reservation during the HOA's so-called planning weekend. It wasn't just questionable. It was illegal. Ellie drafted a formal complaint to the HOA Oversight Authority, an external organization with regulatory power. The document was over 30 pages long and included itemized exhibits, annotated by Mike and formatted like a legal brief. But Ellie didn't just send it. She also scheduled a private meeting with a local news station. They had a segment called Community Watch, where they highlighted HOA abuses and homeowner struggles. When the reporter came to our home, Ellie welcomed her in full uniform. The cameras rolled as she stood by the flag on our porch and calmly explained how she had been targeted, harassed, and gaslit, all for parking in her own driveway. The news aired 3 days later. The title flashed across the screen: Marine Veteran Faces Harassment from HOA President Over Driveway Parking. It went viral overnight. People across the state weighed in, and other residents from Willow Heights began sending messages of support. One even shared a video of Karen yelling at a child for using chalk on the sidewalk, using phrases like property damage and graffiti. Karen tried to defend herself in a follow-up interview but fumbled badly, denying accusations while visibly sweating. Ellie watched the clip, arms folded, then said, "She'll either dig in deeper or try to discredit us next." And she was right. 2 days later, we received a summons. Karen had filed a civil complaint through a friendly attorney claiming that we were orchestrating a smear campaign, violating HOA confidentiality, and threatening her personal safety. Ellie smiled when she read it. Good. Now she's given me an official venue. The court date was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and Ellie immediately began preparing. She cross-referenced documents, collected witness statements, and even had a neighbor notarize their experience of being pressured by Karen to vote for her re-election. It was like watching a general organize an offensive, calm, focused, ruthless in her precision. By the time the pre-hearing mediation was scheduled, Karen had lost half her allies. Board members were resigning or denying involvement. Residents who had once cowered were now speaking openly. Karen arrived to the mediation with a file folder. Ellie brought 2 binders. The mediator barely said 2 words before Ellie laid out her case, page by page, violation by violation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult. She just presented facts, receipts, and rules, all of which Karen had broken. News traveled fast after the mediation. Within days, whispers turned into open conversations, and the once silent residents of Willow Heights were starting to find their voices. Karen's grip on the neighborhood had always been built on two things: fear and isolation, but now both were slipping away. Ellie's calm, relentless exposure of the truth had changed the atmosphere. Neighbors who had kept their heads down began coming out of their houses, knocking on our door, emailing screenshots, forwarding voicemails, and showing up with stories that all followed the same pattern: intimidation, invented fines, and threats masked as neighborly concern. The woman who had once ruled the block with her clipboard was now scrambling to defend herself in multiple directions, and her veneer of control was starting to crack. Karen's behavior, however, didn't calm down. If anything, it spiraled. Instead of backing off, she started lashing out in new, unhinged ways. She accused a neighbor of tampering with HOA signage for trimming hedges too low. She reported a retired couple for unauthorized construction when they replaced a cracked window. And she even filed a noise complaint against a 6-year-old's birthday party for sustained ambient disruption. The neighborhood, once pristine and quiet, now buzzed with tension. Karen had turned her downfall into a last-ditch power grab. But Ellie was 3 steps ahead. One morning, Ellie received a letter from the HOA board marked urgent. It wasn't from Karen this time, but from the acting treasurer, a man named Davis who had remained mostly invisible until now. In the letter, he explained that due to the increasing number of complaints and the formal request for investigation, the county had decided to perform a full audit of HOA operations under Karen's leadership. He thanked Ellie for the documentation and stated plainly that the audit had been approved unanimously by the remaining board members. Karen hadn't even been present for the vote. She had been too busy trying to issue new emergency neighborhood decorum codes and attempting to recruit a few of her friends into volunteer community enforcer roles. It was falling apart right in her hands, but she was still swinging. Karen's next move was both desperate and illegal. Ellie caught it early one morning on the camera feed. A hooded figure, recognizable despite the disguise, crept onto our lawn and yanked our American flag off the pole. She snapped it in half, threw it into a bush, and ran. Ellie watched it all on the footage in complete silence, her eyes narrowing with every second. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood up, walked outside, and retrieved the broken flag. She held it in her hands like a wounded comrade. The next morning, she raised a brand new one, twice the size of the first. Mike came over and helped her reinforce the pole, anchoring it with fresh concrete. By noon, neighbors were driving by slowly, honking in support. One even stopped to salute. The footage of Karen vandalizing the flag was too clear to deny. Ellie reported it to the police. Within 48 hours, Karen was served a formal notice and investigated for criminal mischief and vandalism. The story hit the local news again, now with the added weight of a veteran's property being desecrated. Karen issued a statement through her attorney calling it a misunderstanding, but the footage told a different story. Her attempt to spin things only made it worse. Former allies now turned critics, including a few who had sat on the HOA board, began releasing statements of their own, claiming they'd been pressured or misled into following Karen's orders. The walls were closing in on all sides. And then, as if the universe decided to push things one step further, the state-level HOA Regulatory Council issued a public statement confirming the audit results would be made available the following week. Rumors leaked that several financial inconsistencies had already been uncovered. HOA funds had allegedly been spent on a luxury spa day, multiple catered lunches under the name Outreach Efforts, and a monthly subscription to a wine club in Karen's name. The total amount under review was over $40,000. Ellie didn't celebrate. She barely smiled. She stayed focused, steady, and respectful. Her goal was never to humiliate Karen. It was to stop her. And it was working. Karen must have realized her options were running out because her final play came in the form of a bizarre emergency HOA meeting. Flyers were slipped into mailboxes overnight, written in panicked language claiming the neighborhood was under attack by military-style intimidation and media manipulation. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the community clubhouse. Ellie and I debated attending. Part of her wanted to ignore it entirely. But ultimately she decided to go. Not for Karen, but for the residents who still needed to see the truth with their own eyes. The room was tense when we walked in. Karen was already at the front, looking worn and jittery, her voice loud and shaky as she read from a stack of papers. "This community has always been built on order and decency," she declared. "But now we face a threat from individuals who believe they are above the rules, who weaponize their backgrounds to sow division." Several people glanced at us, then at each other. No one nodded. No one applauded. Ellie didn't react. She just sat down and waited. Karen went on, growing more frantic with each sentence, veering into conspiracy theories and personal grievances, until finally one of the residents stood up and said, "Enough." It was Mr. Wallace, the quiet, retired engineer from 2 streets over. He held a printed copy of the audit summary in his hand. "We have the document. We know what you did. You don't get to play the victim now." Karen sputtered, turned red, and dropped her papers. Ellie stood next. Calm. Measured. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply held up a photo of the broken flag, then a copy of the original HOA rules, and then the audit summary. "I moved here to find peace after a career serving my country. I didn't come here to fight. But I also didn't come here to be silenced." That was all she said. She sat down. And the room erupted, not with chaos but with a long-overdue vote. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. Just quiet, firm decisions. The remaining HOA members held an impromptu recall vote. Ballots were passed, boxes filled. Within 20 minutes, it was official. Karen had been removed as HOA president by an overwhelming majority. She stood frozen at the front, mouth open but voiceless. No one said goodbye as she stormed out of the room, clipboard dangling uselessly from her hand. In the days that followed, a new interim board was assembled. Mike was invited to serve as tech advisor. Mr. Wallace joined as treasurer. Ellie, of course, declined any official title, though she agreed to serve as a policy advisor to ensure a smooth transition. The neighborhood began to feel lighter, freer, and for the first time since we moved in, peaceful. The flag still flew on our porch. The truck still sat in our driveway. And no one complained. In fact, people started waving as they passed. The quiet that settled over Willow Heights in the weeks after Karen's removal was unlike anything we'd experienced since moving in. It wasn't just a lack of drama, it was a complete shift in atmosphere. People were friendlier, more open. Lawns were a little more expressive, with garden gnomes and wind chimes making cautious reappearances. Children chalked colorful drawings on sidewalks without being chased off. Flags waved freely from porches. And for the first time, no one seemed worried about anonymous citations or unspoken rules. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle and profound, like a weight had been lifted that no one fully realized they had been carrying. Ellie, true to form, didn't spend her time gloating. She never once said "I told you so" or strutted through the neighborhood expecting recognition. Instead, she spent her mornings working in the garden she'd finally had time to plant. The old flag still stood proudly beside it, the new pole reinforced and polished. When neighbors walked by, they often stopped to say hello or ask her for advice, sometimes on lawn care, sometimes on what to do about an outdated bylaw. Ellie always answered with a smile and a grounded kind of wisdom that made people feel like they'd finally found someone who understood both the letter and the spirit of fairness. One morning, while sipping coffee on the porch, we noticed an older gentleman approaching the gate. He was tall, slightly hunched, dressed in pressed slacks and a tucked-in polo. In his hand was a manila envelope, and his face was lined with the kind of weariness that didn't come from age alone. He introduced himself as Richard Aldridge, Karen's husband. Ellie stood up and shook his hand. He offered her the envelope without a word at first, just a faint sigh before saying, "She asked me to give this to you." Ellie took it slowly and gave him a long, assessing look. He didn't seem angry or defensive. Just tired. "She's gone to stay with her sister," he continued. "She's not doing well emotionally. None of this went the way she thought it would. I'm not here to defend her. I just figured she owed you some words." When he left, Ellie opened the envelope in silence. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. It started with a strained attempt at civility and quickly unraveled into something rawer. Karen admitted she had been overwhelmed by a need for control after losing her mother, after her children moved away, after retirement left her without purpose. She admitted she had taken the HOA position to feel useful, but somewhere along the way, her mission turned into obsession. She confessed to feeling threatened the moment Ellie arrived, not because of what Ellie did, but because of what she represented. Strength, confidence, respect. The things Karen had lost in herself. Karen didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't ask to be welcomed back. But she did express regret. Regret for underestimating Ellie, for disrespecting her service, and for forgetting that being a leader meant serving others, not ruling them. Ellie read it through once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer of the porch table. "I hope she finds peace," was all she said. That day, the new HOA board hosted its first official meeting under the freshly adopted transparency guideline. It was held in the same clubhouse where Karen had once delivered her proclamations, only now the room was filled with casual laughter, coffee, and open dialogue. Residents spoke freely, ideas were debated respectfully, and the board operated like a team rather than a monarchy. Mike gave a brief tech update about implementing a shared HOA website where residents could review policies, make requests, and even vote digitally on smaller issues. Mr. Wallace reported on the budget, which was finally balanced after auditing all of Karen's extracurricular spending. Near the end of the meeting, the floor was open for community suggestions. One woman raised her hand and proposed an idea that caught everyone by surprise. "I think we should recognize Ellie officially. Not with a plaque or something formal, but maybe a community day? Something for all veterans. This place used to feel like a gated cage. Now it feels like home." That started with her. The room clapped softly, and though Ellie shook her head modestly, the sentiment clearly meant something. The board agreed. A vote was taken. Unanimous. The first Saturday of every November would now be Willow Heights Service Day, a volunteer day dedicated to honoring veterans, first responders, and community helpers with projects, meals, and appreciation. Ellie agreed to help coordinate it but refused to let it be about her. As the weeks passed, our life finally settled into the peaceful rhythm we'd once hoped for. Ellie grew more peppers than she knew what to do with and started trading vegetables with neighbors like it was frontier times. I got involved in a local woodworking group. We even managed to finish our long-delayed sushi-making project, laughing at our clumsy attempts while sitting side by side in the kitchen. The house felt alive now. Not like a fortress defending itself, but like a home inviting others in. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and bathed the yard in gold, a small girl from 2 houses down walked up to our porch with a folded piece of paper. Ellie knelt down to meet her. The girl handed her the note, then ran off giggling. It was a crayon drawing of Ellie in uniform, standing beside the flag. Above it were the words, "My brother says you're a hero." Ellie stared at it for a long moment, then carefully pinned it on the corkboard inside the hallway. "That," she said quietly, "means more than any medal I've ever earned." From that day forward, Ellie became something of a quiet legend in Willow Heights. Not in the way people usually use that word. Not for being loud or flashy or demanding. But for being a symbol of quiet strength. Of integrity. Of standing your ground without trampling others. Karen may have been forgotten by most, her name gradually fading from neighborhood lore. But Ellie became a point of pride, a reminder that not all fights are about shouting or winning. Some are about refusing to back down when you know you're right, about defending dignity, and about doing it all without ever raising your voice. The truck still sat in our driveway. No citations, no complaints, no clipboard carrying interruptions. Sometimes Ellie would lean against it, drink her coffee, and watch the world go by. And when neighbors waved, she'd wave back. Calm, steady, always present. The Marine who had once faced war zones now stood guard over peace, and not with a weapon, but with wisdom. Every now and then, someone new would move into the neighborhood and ask about the flag or the tall woman with the calm voice and military posture. Someone would always answer, "That's Ellie. She's the reason this place runs the way it does now." And if they asked why, they'd get a story. Not about a driveway or a scream or even a broken flagpole, but about a woman who refused to be disrespected and changed everything by standing her ground with quiet grace and unshakable strength. In the end, Karen taught the neighborhood one final lesson, unintentionally, that fear can keep people quiet for a while, but it only takes one person with courage to change everything. Ellie never wanted a fight. She wanted respect, and through patience, truth, and conviction, she got it. Not just for herself, but for an entire community.